Now, Adrian on Twitter reminded me, I did not realize this, he reminded me that this week marks the 10-year anniversary of Sound Off episode 127, where I pitched my own WWE business review, my business plan for WWE. If, hypothetically, Vince McMahon walked out of Titan Tower one day, and I believe the way I phrased it was, Vince McMahon walks out of Titan Tower, and Matt Hardy, who was having some issues at the time, in a drunken rage, drives up from North Carolina through Stamford, and he runs down Vince McMahon in cold blood. And in his will, Vince McMahon leaves WWE not to his wife, not to his kids, but to me. Now, why he would do this is not relevant. But now I have the power, so what moves would I make? Understanding, of course, that some of these ideas were not totally 100% realistic, but I thought many of them were. Many of them could easily have been done. I wanted to take a few minutes here real quick before we end and just review what I pitched 10 years ago. This was 2 years before Raw moved to 3 hours every single week. The show is down 56%, by the way, from where they were ratings-wise in 2012, shortly after moving to 3 hours. 56% reduction in audience. Even if you account for changes in TV and streaming and all that, 56%. That is no small drop. But I went back and I was reviewing, and so again, just real quick, one of the things I did was I was looking at all of the rosters, all the major rosters at the time, the TNA roster, the Ring of Honor roster, various indie workers who may have been available. Who would I bring in? Who would I want to bring to WWE to be on my roster? Well, I looked at the time at the TNA roster, assuming that, let's say, TNA was on death's door, and these talents were available and they were just ripe for the picking. Who would I bring in? I had Kurt Angle on my list because I always wanted Kurt Angle back. Kurt Angle deserved to finish his career at WWE. Jeff Hardy. And Jeff Hardy was actually having some issues himself, not just his brother, at that time. But Jeff Hardy was still a big name. The Pope. I thought the Pope was going to be a bigger star than he turned out to be. Abyss. Always wanted Abyss. I know some people would look at Abyss early on. Oh, he's a knockoff Mankind. Yeah, with the mask maybe he was. And the hardcore stuff, I could see where people would kind of think that. But I thought there was definitely a spot for Abyss to get over the way that Foley did in the Mankind character on the WWE roster and feud with The Undertaker and Kane and people like that. I had people like Samoa Joe on my list, AJ Styles, Desmond Wolfe, Magnus, Jay Lethal, Amazing Red, Doug Williams, Jeremy Borash, Don West, and Taz. On the tag team side, Motor City Machine Guns, Beer Money, Generation Me, and The Beautiful People. I thought all could have been brought in and utilized in my WWE. I would have absolutely pushed for a program between The Undertaker and Sting at WrestleMania. And then, my plan for Sting was to bring him in for a WrestleMania program with The Undertaker, but also give him the DVD treatment and put him in the Hall of Fame. So I had my plan for Sting all ready to go back in 2010. And I thought Ric Flair could be used as a manager or maybe an authority figure to replace the existing authority figure at that time. So as far as the TNA roster, that was my plan for all those people. Ring of Honor. Tyler Black, at the time, had just signed with WWE. I would have brought him in anyway, but he had just been signed. The future Seth Rollins. I would have brought in Colt Cabana, and I would have immediately linked him up with CM Punk. I thought Colt Cabana got a raw deal, his first run in WWE, the Scotty Goldman run. He deserved another chance. I thought there was a lot of potential in doing stuff on camera with him and Punk, given their relationship at the time. Daisy Hayes. Daisy Hayes was a female talent in Ring of Honor who I had seen at many of the live events I had been at. I was impressed by her. I would have brought her in. And Sarah Del Rey, who eventually, she did get hired, but not on TV. She got hired as a trainer down in developmental. I would have brought in, on the tag team side, just two teams, the Briscoes and the Kings of Wrestling. It's a shame that Claudio and Chris Hero never had a chance to do the tag team thing in WWE. On the independent side, there were a lot of people who were independent at that time and not signed to either company who I would have looked into bringing in. Haas and Benjamin. Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas were unsigned at that time. Takeshi Morishima from Noah. Morishima was a big name at that time. Chuck Taylor, who of course now is with Trent, doing the Best Friends act in AEW. Ricochet was on my list. Boy, do I regret that. Mickie James was also not signed to any particular company at that time. And Awesome Kong. So, on the indie side, those are the names I would have looked at. The NXT Season 2 rookies, Kaval, Alex Riley, Michael McGillicuddy, I would have sent him to FCW, and Husky Harris. Those are the names I was interested in. The Divas from NXT Season 3. I thought Lance Storm at that time had a great quote. He said, "My biggest complaint with the Divas NXT season is the experience level of the girls. I don't think most of these girls are ready for TV. Instead of being a pro on the show, I'd rather have WWE send some of these girls to the Storm Wrestling Academy for me to work with them for a few months to better prepare them for NXT." And I agreed with that wholeheartedly. Storm was looked at as very highly regarded as a trainer. And there were a lot of people that trained under him who eventually did sign with WWE, and a lot of women. And I think that would have been a very smart thing to do, and I would have done it. If I were in charge, I would have absolutely worked with Lance Storm. I would have done that. Who would I have sent down to developmental? Who would I have sent back to FCW? Michael Tarver, Darren Young, Lucky Cannon, Percy Watson, my God, with these fucking names, and Lacey Von Erich. Lacey Von Erich, I don't even think is involved in the wrestling business anymore, but those are the people who would have needed more time, or would have needed to first pass through developmental. Now, as far as the developmental is concerned, I would have hired a team of WWE scouts to visit independent events throughout the world. If they were doing any of this at that time, I don't think they were doing too much of it. I think now they do that. William Regal pops up at a lot of independent shows. But I would have hired a dedicated team of scouts, ex-wrestlers, whoever, to go all throughout the world, not just the U.S. Travel the world, observe talent, submit evaluations to management. I would have continued to do what they were already doing, which is having Gerald Briscoe and Jim Ross make scouting trips themselves and submit reports. But what I had pitched was having a dedicated team go all over the world and do that. Now, at the time, this is 2010. There was a report in The Observer at the time that said the key is that WWE is not looking for accomplished workers. They would, in many cases, rather have tall guys with good bodies and good faces who are young, who have never worked before, so they can train them from scratch in their own style. I disagreed and still disagree. And thankfully, WWE has changed since then, but I disagreed wholeheartedly with that philosophy. I always thought that it's better to feature multiple styles instead of just one style, just the WWE style. No one wants to see that. It's nice to have a little bit of variety in the different styles. One of the things that made WCW stand out when they were hot as they ever were. With the cruiserweights mixed in with the main event level heavyweights, you had a nice mix. Also, I made this point at that time. If you're just looking for pretty faces, big jacked up bodies, just think of all the guys, all the people who never would have been given a second look, who were huge stars and legends in the wrestling business. You get a guy like a Dusty Rhodes or an Arn Anderson who comes walking by the performance. I don't even think there was a performance center back then. It was FCW. Performance center didn't exist. But based on these standards that WWE had set in 2010, imagine if Arn Anderson had walked into the building at FCW. They would have taken one look at him and said, "No, we don't need an accountant. We have somebody." They would have thought that he was there for something completely different. It's like, yeah, we don't need that. We don't need the help. It's like, no, I'm here to be a wrestler. Oh, really? Well, not for us. They'd take one look at this guy and they'd send him packing. Jake Roberts, Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Shawn Michaels, for God's sakes, he would have been too small. This is how they were back in 2010. Which, I mean, it was 10 years, but it's not that long ago. And the change in philosophy, and I know there's a lot of people who are going to look at that as being a negative because they don't like all the small guys. Oh, that's what killed WWE. They became indie-rific and they welcomed in all the independent guys who were 5'8". It's just a difference in philosophy. There's some fans who like that. There's some fans who don't. But that's a huge change in philosophy from where we were in 2010 to where we are today. I would have set up additional farm systems beyond just OVW. My idea at that time was to set up a good 3 or 4 different territory-like systems, where talent could rotate. Guys can work in one territory and then be sent to another one to work under different trainers and learn different styles, and they can make a name for themselves on the local scene, working local shows in, let's say, the Florida market, and then they get shipped off somewhere to the Midwest and they get to work there. And maybe they get shipped off to California. Now they're out in the West Coast. And they're learning from different people there, and they're working spot shows there. So that was one, and I think the Storm Wrestling Academy up in Canada, that could have been one of those territories. Because he wasn't just training people, but for a while there, Lance Storm was actually running shows as well. So I love the idea of having this rotating territory-like system where people can go and train and learn. The creative team. I would have surrounded myself with people who actually were knowledgeable about wrestling booking. And some of the names I floated at that time, and it is kind of funny now to look back on this, but Paul Heyman was on my list, Dutch Mantell was on my list, and Jim Cornette was on my list. I suspect that probably would not have ended well with Cornette, but there's no denying that he definitely would have had something to contribute. I feel like all of these guys have something that they can contribute. They have things they're good at. They have things they're not so good at. So you bring guys like that on board to try to help you out, and I think that they put you on the right path. But I used to talk about how, boy, it just felt like WWE Television used to be so much better. When it was literally just 2 guys writing the show. It was Vince McMahon. He was the filter, but they'd meet at Vince's house by the pool. You've heard these stories of Vince McMahon having poolside meetings at his home. Bruce Pritchard is there and Pat Patterson is there. It's the 3 of them. And they're booking shows out for months. Now they have a lot more television to produce. Live television than they did back then. The roster is so much bigger now, so I don't know that 2 or 3 people could do it, but do you really need an army of 30 people? Look at the product. Doesn't seem to be doing a lot of good when everything is ultimately just coming down to one guy. The system back then was so much more simple. Pay-per-views. I am not a fan. I'm still not a fan, to be honest with you. But back then, they were having 13 pay-per-views a year. 13, 14 pay-per-views. Sometimes 2 in 1 month. I would have reduced that back down to the Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, King of the Ring, SummerSlam, Survivor Series. And then in between, you can set up these other special shows, whether it's a Clash of the Champions type show, to kind of bridge the gap from one pay-per-view to the other by having these other special shows in between. Whether those were pay-per-views or just TV specials, it probably would have been just a TV special. Wrestlers probably would not have been thrilled about losing those extra pay-per-view payoffs, but that's one of those things I would have, as the chairman and CEO, that's one of those things I would have had to work through. But I talked about War Games becoming an annual Survivor Series tradition. What else did I talk about here? I talked about a whole bunch of things. Talked about bringing in Jim Ross for special events only, to call certain shows and certain matches with Michael Cole and Jerry Lawler. And that's really what WWE ended up doing. They would bring Jim Ross in for a special WrestleMania match each year. That's the role I would have envisioned for him going forward. Television, I would have completely revamped the whole NXT concept. The NXT concept back then was a joke. I would have had a season of 10 guys paired off on teams of 5. Each team led by a WWE pro. I basically would have followed the Ultimate Fighter format, but I would have applied it to NXT. And the season, the NXT season, would have built to a program between the two pros. Like with the Ultimate Fighter, it built to a fight between the two coaches. So that postseason would have led to a pay-per-view match. But each episode, under my idea, would have focused on a different rookie, or would have focused on drama between them and show them training at the gym or at FCW shows. You have a match at the end of each show. Judges would determine who stays and who gets cut based on their performance, based on their promos. So that was my idea for that. TNA Reaction was one of the, I think, Eric Bischoff ideas during his run there in TNA that I actually liked. I remember that TNA Reaction show. I thought it was very well done. I think WWE should have had a similar type of show. I would have killed the guest star concept. I think by that point we had already gotten Bob Barker. There was no beating Bob Barker. I would have killed the guest host concept dead a lot earlier than they did. I pitched the idea of having backstage pay-per-view reports with Josh Matthews or Jeremy Borash or Don West, similar to what they used to do many years ago with Gene Okerlund and Todd Pettengill, where instead of just having the announcers sitting at ringside and just doing kind of a voiceover, well, here are the matches coming up at the next pay-per-view, you cut away and have an actual pay-per-view report and bring people up to speed on, okay, the latest announcements, here's the latest match added to the next show. But they feel they can't do stuff like that now. You got to keep things moving. It's TV. People are going to lose interest. They're going to turn off. I don't know that I necessarily think doing a segment like that is going to turn away 200,000 people, but I assume there's a reason why they don't do that. And then just some final miscellaneous ideas. I would have ended the brand split. I'm sure that's shocking, right? 10 years later to hear me talking about this back then. But what I would have done is I would have kept the rosters still somewhat separate. I just wouldn't have had the handcuffs in place where you absolutely can't do this and you absolutely can't do that. I was arguing for a top 10 power rankings for the WWE Championship, top 5 for all other belts. I pitched bringing back managers. This was during a period where WWE, it was like they were allergic to managers. You had Jim Mitchell was available, Joel Gertner, even Byron Saxton I floated. Larry Sweeney. What a sin that Larry Sweeney never had a run as a manager in WWE. The other idea that I forgot about this, that I pitched, maybe this is the Vince McMahon-esque side of me coming out here. But if I were running the company, and I see all of these, like WrestleMania weekend and stuff, you have all these wrestling conventions, and they're piggybacking off my events and everything, right? I always thought to myself, if I'm WWE, why wouldn't I just host my own Legends conventions? And I invite all these legends in, and I can probably pay them a little bit more than they're going to make working, a convention somewhere else. And just host my own Legends conventions with all these same people and put all these other conventions out of business. That's what I would have done. I said, well, anything, if you guys can do it, then I can do it, surely. But some other ideas that I don't know if they did it and we just don't know, or if they just never thought to do it. They put together some incredible DVD documentaries. And I think it's a real mistake if they didn't submit them to film festivals. That was one of the ideas that I had back then, is to submit some of their DVD documentaries to film festivals for awards consideration. I would have hired Don West and brought him in to run wild with WWE Shop. Like a bulldog, just let him loose. You would have sold so much merch with this guy. And the other thing I would have done is I would have lifted the ban that they had in place, which I don't know if it's a complete lift now, but there's definitely more access now than there was 10 years ago. They had an outright ban for many years on giving interviews, letting their talent do interviews with wrestling news websites, even like the really reputable ones, like a PW Insider or a OneWrestling.com or the Observer or the Torch. It was just a total ban. And I would have lifted that ban and made some of the stars a little more accessible for certain interviews when it came to some of those websites. So anyway, that was the kind of the quick overview. I dedicated a lot more time, over 90 minutes to this, more in depth. If you want to hear the full review, it's up in the archives, episode 127 from, I guess it was September. It might have been September 25th of 2010. Always interesting to go back and take a look at stuff like that.